All right, so what I want to do for a demonstration today is go over mainly how to use aluminum foil. You can use paper instead of aluminum foil. It's not like it's the only way to work. Foil is just a little easier to work with just because you can mash it up and it holds its shape. But I want to also go over making something more abstract. A few people have been asking me about that, or at least have been asking. They're not really sure what they're going to do for that yet. That's fine. So far, I've been working on a couple of little things here. As an experiment, I was making my little dinosaur head, little more of Jurassic Park raptor or actual Deinonychus, if you actually know what you're doing. And then I was making some kind of, I don't know, finger monster that, I don't know, like a chopped off finger and turned into an eyeball monster thingy. Because one of my favorite movies is The Thing. So yeah, why not have every part's a whole kind of thing. But let's look at other stuff. So got my little blocks of clay. You want to go ahead and chop these up again so that they're actually like usable size. Using my little pencil clay cutter here, or my pencil handled clay cutter, wire tool, works really well for cutting up chunks. But what I'm going to start with is a piece of foil, which is not going to focus very well. There we are. So I am going to pull a small chunk of this off first because I want to use this as a texturing tool. So hold on to this. I'm not crushing it up, just loosely kind of balling it. Set that aside. But aluminum foil obviously is going to work well because you can crush it up to whatever you need. You can shape it to whatever shape you need, and it'll obviously hold that. Now, one of the elements of this project is that it has to have somehow a hole through it, a pierce through element. So immediately what comes to mind is some sort of like, I don't know, almost donut-y thing. I just want donuts. Anyway, so some of the examples kind of turned into like more of like a teardrop shape. You can have multiple holes through it. So I could start with maybe turning this into like a kind of like this hollow shell kind of frame. But just mushing up the foil into itself really helps to begin making a frame. Because one, this also is a little bit easier to just quickly shape into, well, shapes, and just see what you might like out of it. So there's a kind of sort of something or other. And frankly, that's really what the abstract piece is intended to be. Amorphous. You're not trying to make an abstraction from something. You can kind of, in this case, while that functionally would be an abstract sculpture, in this case, we're considering abstract versus representational, at least in the case of this looks like what it's supposed to be, in this case, some kind of finger monster, but this one is going to be just more of an amorphous shape that is more of focusing on texture and the overall surface. So I'm going to go with something kind of like this. Granted, it kind of also starts to look like an aluminum foil hat, but that's kind of unavoidable. But if you have a starting point of a foil shape, and you can, of course, keep adding to it, things like that, it makes it a lot easier as a starting point, namely because you don't have to have a solid brick of clay. Now, it's a little warm in here today, so that's great. Keeps the clay a little bit warmer. And what I'm going to do is just start skinning over this. And what I mean by that is just literally laying clay on top all around. You're not trying to maintain a thickness, although maintaining at least a minimum thickness is helpful depending on how much you're going to carve into this. And you can just keep adding on. The very least is that in not having to make this a solid piece of clay, it makes it a little bit lighter. But if you're really trying to work through the form, as you've all kind of figured out, a solid brick of clay doesn't exactly move very well. Smaller elements can be blended together more effectively for a better bond, but it also allows you to just make a larger, thicker shell, or rather a larger, thicker object without it having to be solid. Just makes it a little bit easier to work with. And it's still perfectly pliable. Yes, I'm building up on top of this, but this is still very manipulatable. So it's not really limiting, or at least I haven't found it to be. So I'm just going to keep working with this. I'm just skinning over all this foil here. And like I said, I'm not really trying to make a shape. This is something you could totally do. Hell, if you work by feel, which a lot of when I'm sculpting, I can do kind of like typing. Once you kind of know your tools, your hands in this case, just kind of getting a rough shape. Now, that's not exactly very accurate for an analogy because obviously typing, you kind of have to know what you're doing and the specific keys. Otherwise, it's just word salad on a page. Actually, it's not even word salad. It's just gibberish. Whatever. So I'm just mushing all this up. Now, one of the things is, say you're working along here and you're skinned all this over and you decide, you know what, actually I want this side to be a lot thicker. Well, does that mean you should add a lot more clay to it? Or can you encapsulate another ball of foil? Yes, the answer is yes. You could do either. Doesn't really matter which one. Like I said, this is simply a core that is a little bit easier to work with. It immediately gives you a rough shape. And doesn't have to be solid clay. Other benefit, of course, is that it gives a little bit of structure. And if this were all solid clay, depending on the temperature of the room temperature or whatever, it can start to slump if it's too heavy and unsupported. That's certainly where like a wire armature comes into play, but the foil gives it more volume. Now, question on that is, well, can you use both? Yeah, absolutely. You could have your wire frame. I know this is my wire tool, but you have your wire frame, wrap it in foil, and that way you have the strength of the wire, but then you also have the volume fill of the aluminum before you add wire. Or one way or the other, meaning like you don't have to, it doesn't have to be like in that specific order. It could be foil here this way, and then I could start adding parts on through like wire armature and just stabbing down into the wire or stabbing down into the foil. And then I can start building on top like that. Doesn't really matter. Main things, if you are trying to be very specific with your frame, then yeah, the wire works really well for a specific frame. If you're trying to just build up some volume, then the aluminum foil works really well to do that. But again, this is also super helpful that this clay is a little bit warm today. Especially when you're trying to, at the just sticking things on phase, because if it's too cold, or really just cool, it's not going to be as sticky, which obviously is beneficial for doing surface details. But if you're trying to move clay around, and as you see what I'm doing, is I'm smearing the clay back and forth. Yes, that's smoothing the surface, but what it's also doing is actually bonding the clay to itself. You can't just stick the clay together and it'll hold. Yes, it'll stick, but it's not really bonding very well. It's kind of like if you've ever done any ceramics work. Yeah, the clay will stick together if it's wet, if it's kind of gooey and sticky, but eventually as it dries, it'll just plop apart. Similar thing here is as it gets cool, it won't be as sticky and it's less likely to stick together unless you blend it together. Same thing with water-based clay, unless you use slip, you really muck up, like literally making a more watery mixture and squash it all together, blend it all together, same deal. Then you'll get a good bond. Then it'll be stronger. Same thing here. Drawback, of course, is when I start actually doing detail work, this clay is going to be way too sticky to work with. But for now, in fine-tuning my shape, this works very well. Just about finished covering this. I don't know that I want it that way. I think tear it apart, and it's going to go in kind of different shape, different directions. Because reasons. If I like that or not. So I am trying to make sure I have a bare minimum of wall thickness around the foil, namely so I can just at least carve into it without, or when I go to carve into it, I can do so without it exposing the foil and everything. Now, do you have to have foil under every section? Absolutely not. Like this whole thing here, this protrusion here, that could have been without foil. There's no need for that necessarily. But in this case, I did. So there we are. Yeah, play with shapes. Like literally play with shapes. This is, especially the abstract form, this is very much intended to be an experiment in form just as much as it is an experiment in texture and surface. The clay allows you to readily change any of that. So I'm still just continuing to smooth all this out. But again, what I'm really doing is I'm also blending it together. It's not just me smoothing the surface. Yes, it's doing that most certainly, but it's also blending any odd areas that have not been properly bonded. And is this extra sticky? Oh my, yes. Now, where am I going to go with the surface texture? That is a very reasonable question. No idea yet. Maybe I'll start playing, or rather, I'll play around with form a bit more first, and maybe the texture will come to me. In smoothing the thing out, at least it kind of starts to, well, it becomes more uniform. And just use your hands. This is really the best set of tools you can use for this project. As I'm trying to smooth sections out, some areas might flatten out, and I can embellish that. This kind of starts turning into like a little bit flatter surface. Why not add to it? It's kind of starting to turn into like a foot. I don't know. Yeah, play about. So now this has technically a pierced through element, has a hole there, but it also, the form also moves in and out of itself. I could start adding additional elements, start deciding if this even has a specific position. So maybe it kind of does, has this round through. Maybe what I'll start doing is start adding just random texture into that. You know, we were talking about using, some of you are already using things like odd tools like the straw, things like that. Like I was saying, aluminum foil really makes for a great press detail or press surface. So I can start playing with rolling this into the surface and getting this just weird undulating, almost stone-like surface, although very aggressive. I might decide, you know what, I kind of want it to only be on one side, almost like it's a animal pattern or something. So I can start to smooth out the edges where it goes too far. Or maybe instead I'll start adding like a border texture. And that could be like a bunch of little just pokes, just randomized. This could become kind of like a pattern that just works its way around the form. Maybe these patterns start to split off and do their own thing. Kind of starts to swirl around the piece. Now, I wouldn't recommend going into your surface or your rather your textures just yet until you've gotten your overall surface really where you want it. That said, like, you know what? I don't really like that texture at all. no problem. Etch a sketch it. Basically just smoothing right over, and it's gone. So that's, of course, a warning too of, while you're working, be careful of where you're touching it. This is why I say, like, yeah, it's great that it moves so easily when it's warm. Problem is it moves, this clay moves so easily when it's warm, it's hard to, or it can be hard to handle it, literally with your hands, and not put like fingerprints and everything all through it. So be cautious. And if you're overly worried about that, or I won't say overly worried, if you're appropriately worried about that, rather, this is what I was talking about in, you know what? Got this going, I'm not sure where I'm going next. Set it aside. Let it cool. Even better is if you have the fridge. I would not recommend putting this on like directly on the rack. Maybe put it on like a paper plate. Stick it in the fridge. Let it cool off. Hell, if it's in the fridge, leave it there for a while. Let it get cold. It won't, the surface won't move as much, but that can be exactly what you're wanting. You might want it to be more rigid so that you could be more detailed with the surface. Well, right now I'm just going to keep smoothing it at the moment. But yeah, don't be, I won't say don't be afraid to. There's no reason to be afraid of it. I don't know why I say that. There's nothing wrong with having a couple of pieces going at the same time. And hell, some people have already talked about, like, well, I kind of like where these two are going in their own ways, but I'm not really sure if I like it. Yeah, sculpt something else. Now, is there a minimum size for these pieces? Yeah, kind of. You don't want it to be so small that it's just nothing. And this clay, because as it gets warm and things like that, it's very difficult for it to work too small, because it just ends up being like little gloops. Yeah, see, this is getting way too sticky. Everything's just coming apart on me. But if I let this cool, I can go back to saying, like, my little finger beast, my little finger monster here is definitely a little bit cooler in temperature, so I can go back to working the, maybe with the eyeball. Give it its mildly unsettling iris back. Even this is honestly a little too sticky. So other thing might just be, yeah, open a door and let the room cool off, because this is actually quite warm. But that's also because the heater's on in this room. So yeah, have a couple of pieces going at the same time and let them cool. But abstract can really just be that. Just start playing with it. Literally start playing with it. You don't have to have an idea in mind. Yes, we went over sketches, we went over ideas. But as I said at the time, I fully intended those to be much more of starting points. You don't have to stick directly to them. If you choose to, great. But you can certainly just let the form start to be its own thing with this abstract piece. Get a little lost in it, play around with it, just see where it takes you. But main thing is why I wanted to show with the aluminum foil core is, yeah, it helps you take up volume really quickly. It gives you a good reference points for how you're going to build the piece before you start skinning it with clay. But also, you won't use nearly as much. So if you wanted to work with both your pieces going at the same time, you'll just have more extra material at the same time with a core in there. This one is just solid clay except for the wire and the armatures inside the legs. But with this, my abstract having that aluminum foil core, that definitely allows you to stretch your material farther. And so you're not ending up having to use up all your clay on one. But as I said, you don't even have to have both of them going at the same time if you don't want to. You can most certainly use all your clay on one, finish it, document it, mush it apart, start the other one, or vice versa. So it's up to you, but I'll keep playing with this. But I just wanted to do a quick video on some starting points for working with abstract or creating something abstract, and just see how it goes. That's pretty much exactly what I'm doing. As I'm smoothing, some shapes start to appear. some kind of general forms. It'll morph a little bit. It'll keep twisting. Let it go. Why not? Let this one flow and just kind of be whatever you want. Obviously, kind of guide it, but yeah, let it just see what happens. Some surfaces will start to fold into themselves, maybe start to accentuate, like this kind of started to have a little bit of a groove into it. So I'm kind of sweeping that groove a little bit deeper and intentionally making it more noticeable. This kind of started to flatten out. So that's exactly what I'm doing. Just kind of stretching the sides out a little bit. I don't know if I like it or not yet, but just seeing where it takes me. The abstract is largely, yes, it's an abstract form, but it is largely a vehicle simply to carry different experiments in texture over its surface. So let that be what it is, unless you just have some things very specific in mind. And if so, good on you. I, at the moment, do not. This is starting to turn into some kind of very twisted, like inflatable pool toy. At least to me it is. Okay. So play around with it. See where abstract takes you. I'll keep messing with this, and then when I start adding texture, we'll go over that too. All right, so now that the piece has cooled off a bit, so I had to give it a little bit of time to come down. Once you're doing all that, when you're doing that kind of mashing material around and such, it really builds up a lot of heat. So now I'd start playing with surface textures. Now, granted, it still needs some more detailing work, and there's still some odd bits down inside and such, but yeah, you can start playing with, start playing with texture. And really, there's no wrong or right way to do this aside from, yeah, you just want to actually experiment with it, see what seems correct. Like this thing, I ended up with this kind of odd end here. Maybe I start to develop that. I showed you some examples of like Pomodoro's work, the big spheres that have like internal components and things like that. That could certainly be an approach, as well as one of the others they kind of looked like big M&Ms that had some sort of internal structure looking going. So you could do something to that effect, meaning like, all right, I've had this odd flat spot. Maybe you start like scooping out elements here. Now, none of the tools are really what I think I would like to use. So you could maybe just use internals, almost like, all right, this is for some reason turning into like little bricks. I don't know, something to that effect, oddly enough. Or you could add to that. Now this is just one small section. I was cutting out all of these little spheres here. I showed you one of the student examples. They used a bunch of different size spheres to give this kind of like almost scale texture. So you could do something to that effect. You could change around the sizes, playing around with that. Maybe a couple different sizes. And these are just little spheres, little balls, just squishing into the surface. Might be a little bit too tight. You might want to go back in and fine tune some of these so they're a little bit cleaner edged. Clean your tools a little bit here and there so they don't get too gummed up. So yeah, just playing around with different materials, or rather different textures. It's all the same material. I'm used to saying different materials. This kind of gives it this odd like stone paver kind of look going on the end here. But yeah, just experiment. Ultimately, any of this is reversible or changeable. None of your ideas are set, meaning that any of the sketches you submitted, you are not locked into those. If you'd like to change them or evolve them, go for it. It's not like you have to maintain this. Now, this is just kind of an odd surface I was curious about. Now, with something like this, all right, great. From this side, looks good. How do you blend that? Now, that could mean maybe you continue this texture around, and continue adding these little spheres all the way down the side. Maybe that's like a singular element, and instead I more of blend the edges. If I need to add a little bit of coil here or something, that could work. So now I'm just kind of blending the edge so that kind of paved texture thing really only appears on the front. Although it definitely kind of starts to look like some kind of odd growth. But hey, that's kind of in the vein of all of this stuff. Like I said, one of my favorite tools is using like a brush or so. I like using that to pat a surface. So maybe around the sides, I start to develop. I need to clean this. It's getting a little sticky. And this is a wire brush, a lighter gauge or like toothbrush, plastic brush, something like that. That works really nicely. But you can start to develop this really heavy texture. Of course, a smaller brush would more easily get down inside. But this could be something you continue down and around. Because as I said, one of the things about the abstract piece is it's not just having some sort of a hole in it. You want that to be one of the focal points, but you want the texture you choose to bring the viewer's eye around the thing. So you want to see that, but then you want to look and you want to be able to look in different directions. Now that of course brings in, well, what's the orientation? Maybe this kind of sits more like that, upright. Obviously from the camera view means it would sit something more like this, so that would be more visible. I don't know. Still playing with this. I don't know that I like this texturing on here. I might actually turn that into more of a scale form. So don't like it? Great. Smooth it all back out. Like I said, you can just etch a sketch the form, etch a sketch the surface, and start to develop it. One of the things I have found that if I kind of do start to develop like a flatter area, that's something that I might want to develop further, in that it kind of starts to turn into like, think of like a snake or some kind of reptile's underbelly, or really any animals, the distinction between like the rest of the sides and top versus the underside, that usually has a distinct texture. You could kind of start to play with that. Maybe that kind of flatter side, I start to pull down and around. Maybe that means I start to make that a little more distinct. So I want to add a little bit of material to be able to give a little bit of a ridge there. So now this side here ends up being just a bit more flat. So yeah, just playing with that. And then maybe that's something that becomes maybe like scales or so. So under here, maybe I start to draw some kind of like an underbelly kind of thing going. Remember we discussed in the very first assignment, repetition and pattern. So pattern is definitely something that can start to play into this. Repeating pattern becomes an overall texture, basically. See what comes of it. Experiment. But that's largely what I wanted to make sure to go over today, is being able to show you some examples of how to use aluminum foil as a armature base, but also maybe some starting points for an abstract form. I'm just cleaning up that edge there so that kind of odd texture there of these little spheres, these little ball things, end up being more isolated. Kind of want that to look like just an open end. Although it also kind of looks like torn styrofoam. Don't know. Can look like a lot of things. That's the thing about abstract work, is it can kind of look like a lot of things, but it doesn't specifically look like any one thing. So yeah, and kind of weird omni snake thing. I don't know. Play around with it some more, see what comes of it. But there you go. Just wanted to show you all some different ways that you could use the aluminum foil as a core, as a surface material, as a surface texturing material, or tool rather, and just kind of how you could go about starting and developing an abstract piece. See where it comes, see what comes of it. And remember, if it starts getting too gummy, set it aside, go put it in the fridge, run some cold water over it, whatever. The water's not going to affect it. It's oil. It'll repel the water itself. You're just trying to get the thing to cool off a little bit so that you can handle it again without it being too overly gummy. So there we go. Play around.